Welcome to Objects of Obsession and welcome to the Bethlem Museum of the Mind, where we're surrounded by a fascinating range of objects and artifacts that explore the history of mental illness and our perception of it. And joining me, having selected an extraordinary object from this collection as a way of exploring her own extraordinary work, is an artist who has used everything from explosions and shootings to steamrollering and sleeping in pursuit of her art. I refer, of course, to the preeminent artist Cornelia Parker, who's here with us now. Cornelia, welcome and thank you for doing this. Your object, your image, your personage is here between us. What was it and is it that compels you so much about this?
There's a sketch of an idea for Crazy Jane by Richard Dadd, and I first saw it only a couple of years ago when I came here as a judge on the Museum of the Year. But it kind of unpacked when I first saw Richard Dadd, which was when I was 15. When I went to the Tate Gallery and I saw the Fairy Fella's masterstroke, which just the idea of the Fairy Fella, this masterstroke, and then knowing he'd killed his father. I suppose it captured my imagination. Teenage, full of hormones, and I sort of identified very closely with it.
So, without over-analysing, this is a trigger back to the beginnings of your journey as an artist. I mean, at the age of 15, when you first saw the Dadd painting at the Tate, did you think that I want to be an artist, or did it seem a long way?
I think it was on that. I spent a week in London with my two school teachers and a whole group of us who were going to do A-level art, and that was the moment when I thought, oh, perhaps I could be an artist. Seeing for the first time, going to museums for the first time and seeing things firsthand, and Richard Dadd, just the intricacy of his work. And the fact that it just had so many hours embedded in it. At the time, I was doing very sort of miniature drawings myself. So I kind of thought, wow, this is amazing.
We'll come back to Dadd as an outsider later on, but it is interesting that there's certain artists, Van Gogh would be one, Richard Dadd would be another, for whom the biography we can't escape, and in some ways, nor should we. But this is still a compelling image, whether you know about Dadd himself or where he was when he created it.
Yes, I suppose when I saw the Fairy Fella's masterstroke, and it mentioned Bedlam and Bethlem, and I was, immediately there's a name to a place where the criminal insane might be, or the idea of being in Bedlam. So it conjured up this space, and my mother, this is personal, but my mother was experiencing schizophrenia at the time, so I was living with a mad mother. So, I kind of, it struck a huge chord.
How is it then seeing this work, and we are right at the heart of Bethlem, in relation to what you just told me? Does this seem more resonant, or when you look at a work like this, are you relatively detached from it?
No, I think this is very resonant. Coming here a couple of years ago, it struck loads of chords. My mother had lots of electric shock treatment, for example. There's a video around the corner, showing somebody having electric shock treatment. I didn't quite understand what that meant, but just saw the consequence of it. But this particular image I like just because it's sort of you having eye-to-eye contact with Crazy Jane, and it looks like a male face. And I think he must probably use one of his fellow inmates as a model.
Or himself. There is a strong theory amongst the hierarchy of this museum. This is a self-portrait, and I kind of buy that, having seen images of Dadd. There is a photograph of him, and there seems to be a strong resonance.
So it's like a self-portrait?
Yeah. Or that's one layer.
Yes. Well, it could easily be that. But for me, it wasn't that attracted me. Very often you look at a piece of work and you don't know its back history and all the rest of it. And with Richard Dadd's, when I first saw it, the story of why he was incarcerated came later. I think the image was the thing that attracted me at first. And this one's very different from the Fairy Fella's masterstroke. It's much more loose. It's bursting out of the frame. It's almost like it's in there's a movement there. Whereas the other one is much more static and much more it's almost like it's taken thousands of hours to paint.
Yes, I mean I think Dadd paintings in general and the Fairy Fella's in particular are so detailed and controlled. There's still an element of manual control and dexterity, but there's that kind of explosive aspect to this work. I mean, she seems to burst out of the frame. She stretches at the picture frame, would be a formal way of analysing the picture. I don't want to be over-reductive, but you know where I'm going on this. I mean, I mentioned explosions at the beginning. You blew up a shed, an innocent shed full of domestic objects and artefacts in the name of art. There must be some kind of chord. I don't mean every time you see anything that looks explosive, you think of your own work, but the idea of something banal being exploded and then reconstructed.
Yeah, I think there's a vulnerability about this, and I suppose the garden shed, which is supposed to be the safe place at the end of the garden that you put all your overspill, and it being a safe haven somehow, and then the idea of it being blown apart, and then trying to piece that back together again, which is what my cold hot matter and exploded view is about, really. And that the cold hot matter, which is unquantifiable matter in the universe, but also unquantifiable matter in your mind, to do with dark places in just the domestic, I suppose. So I don't like my work being autobiographical at all, but a lot of those things I was tussling with, and so the idea of the safe haven being broken apart, but then you could perhaps try and make a formalised diagram of that, or the exploded view is a formalised diagram. So I was trying to contain something that was which you can't contain or can't measure.
Yes, contain something, transform material, and then reassemble it. I mean, and the way that was displayed, suspended from the gallery ceiling, beautifully lit, it then became, you could see it as kind of diagrammatic for particle physics, although it was a piece of visual poetry. But I also, I had the pleasure of, I think it was a pleasure actually, being there when a group of us went to watch you blow the shed up with the army out in Oxfordshire. And I wondered then, and I still wonder now, whether there was an element of working. The army are symbols of the establishment. The artist is often seen as anti-establishment. Was that the case then, and where do you stand in relation to that idea now? Well,
it was the case then, and I suppose it's still the case now. I think artists, having taught in art schools for 15 years, I know a lot of artists, budding artists are perhaps, they end up doing art because they perhaps didn't fit into any other genre, and that there's a, I remember when I was teaching, I was thinking, it's like being a psychoanalyst, trying to help people dig themselves out of deep holes in terms of their creativity was a very good kind of way of unravelling your own psyche.
Which brings back to Dad, actually. The idea that he is, one of the ultimate outsiders, but yet is incarcerated, so he's enclosed. We know his position was anti-authority. He wanted to kill the Pope. He did actually kill his father. How much can something as extreme as that resonate, and how much do you have to get around that? Because he was a convicted criminal. He probably, we would imagine, it's some form of it was a form of psychosis. There's a tendency to romanticise, and yet we should also understand and try and be sympathetic to a certain extent. How do you navigate all of that? Or is that just an art historian's point of view or a psychoanalyst's point of view, and an artist is at liberty to take whatever line they want?
Well, I think they're at liberty to take whatever line they want. There is a romantic idea of the crazy artist in their garret, and I suppose that's always been, and writers and musicians and people, Mozart, I went to see Amadeus last night, and he seemed like he might be crazy too. And so, it's almost like having too many portals in your mind open, too many doorways, too many opportunities, too many things to look at. And it's about controlling that. I did like the fact that Dad had, being incarcerated, he had all that time, and materials to make work inside the institution. And he could explore this not very institutionalised world that he inhabited. And that's curious. Now I'm not sure if, the idea of having all those hundreds of hours to make work is quite a privileged thing.
Do you need to lock yourself away, metaphorically sometimes, to get on with a project? Or, it seems to me that if you look at the range of the work you've produced, you, by definition, have to learn to work in all sorts of contexts, all sorts of circumstances. So you're not a studio-bound artist, but I still wonder about the discipline of metaphorically locking yourself away to finish something.
I think locking myself away is, I don't find a creative space at all. In fact, I'm much better at working on the hoof. Like if I'm locked away, I can prevaricate for hours, years, months. I can spend an awful lot of time getting lost in my own world. But when I'm making work in a public space, you know, like a large-scale work I have to make on site, or if I'm working in interaction with people, I have to make decisions very quickly, and I'm not, you know, sort of thinking of all the various different scenarios there are. So for me, creativity is being mobile, is being in situations, thinking outside the box. You know, I've just spent the last few months being the general election artist. You know, cross-party group of MPs chose me to be their election artist. So, and then it took me months after the election to get permission to say fly a drone in the House of Commons, to drone blue newspapers around. And, you know, so really sometimes it's about getting access to somebody else's ivory tower. Or
so the idea is inspiring for us on the outside, and it may be inspiring for you at the beginning, but actually there is a huge amount of legwork and communication necessary in order to facilitate something as, well, relatively simple as getting access to the detritus or some trace of memory of Sigmund Freud, for example. But then you have to go through the process of liaising with the museum, Freud's museum, seeing if you can get access to, I think it was a feather out of his pillow, and so on.
Well, I was handling the pillow. I borrowed all these artefacts from all over, you know, various museums in London for a piece called The Maybe, which is a collaboration with Tilda Swinton, where she lay in a glass case just for 1 week at the Serpentine Gallery in 1995. Yeah. And so I had about 35 objects I'd borrowed, including the pillow and blanket off Freud's couch, which I felt was really important because that piece was more about the unconscious and you know, the third of our lives we spend asleep. And also, all the objects belong to dead people, so she, you know, Tilda was representing the living, all of us, you know, she was unfinished business yet. But when I had this pillow, at one point I was thinking perhaps Tilda should lie on it, but I didn't, I kept it separate. So she was just there, asleep, and the pillow had all these spiky little feathers sticking out of it, the way that feathers do stick out of cushions. And so I was, when I went back to the museum, I said, you know,
could I have one?
You know, I said they're halfway out.
But it's still a big negotiation, was it?
Well, I mean, I had a very sympathetic museum. Small museums tend to be the most flexible on those kind of things. I just said, you know, what happened if it fell out and it was on the floor? Would you vacuum it up? Or would it be put back carefully into the cushion? She said, oh, have it. And then, I remember going to the Hans Christian Andersen Museum in Odense in Denmark, and talking to the museum director there, and he showed me a little blotter off Hans Christian Andersen's table, and he said, oh, well, this is, you know, he used this, and it's falling apart, and a little piece fell off, and I was... He said, oh, yes, you can have it, and I thought this could be, you know, you could have blotted the princess or the P or the emperor's new clothes, you know, this is kind of somehow the inverse of this big figure.
So materials or objects or found objects for you are sacred, or they're the things that trigger memories, but they're conveyors of meaning, and the notion that there is an unconscious attached to each object in the way we perceive that seems to be very strong.
Yeah, I mean, the Duchamp might use a new object, like, you call it a ready-made, you know, buy something from the shop, like a bottle rack. But I quite like the objects, the found objects that have had a history, you know, like, it wasn't any old feather, it was a feather that had lain in the darkness for, you know, many years, listening to Freud's patients passively, and then it finally emerged and, you know, escaped, and then I put it in a glass slide and I projected it anamorphically along the wall, this little broken feather, and it looked like it'd been shot from a bow and arrow, and I called it projection, you know, which is a psychoanalytical term. So I'm very interested in psychology, obviously. I suppose if you have a mental illness in your family, you've kind of, it's like, you know, you get to know as much as you can about the territory.
Which then still brings us back to the self. How much, or where are you locatable in your work? I mean, you're the author, but how detached are you, and how much should we or can we seek Cornelia Parker or a subconscious manifestation of Cornelia Parker in her work?
Well, I don't really want people to be thinking about me when they're looking at my work. You know, it's like a piece of music. You'd be transported somewhere else for yourself. My work's not autobiographical in that way. Obviously, because every artist who makes their work has got some of them in it. But I don't want it to be about issue-based work in that way. I want it to be released. You know, the opposite. I want it to be liberated from all that, you know, sort of baggage to do with the biography, I suppose.
So there's no sense of you transposing, as Dad may have done here, an image of himself projecting into another image?
Well, I mean, I think what attracts me is most probably it's the opposite, the way I'd make my work. You know, I would never do a piece of work like this, and so very often I'm sort of drawn to things that are the opposite to the way I would. I mean, I love Duchamp, and I love the way he, you know, annexed objects and used them to convey meaning. But this is very different. This is looking you in the eye, and this is somebody who's mad and engaging with you, and so it's a very visceral thing. And I suppose in this museum, which is full of, you know, work, similar work in, I mean, at all different levels of technique, you know, it's not about technique necessarily, it's to do with, you know, because he's obviously a very brilliant craftsman, you know, he has wonderful technique, and he's a trained artist, so he's not a...
trained at the Royal Academy schools, which is a kind of another... I mean, it's not a push for the Royal Academy, it's the fact that there's a connection with you, that you are now a member of the Royal Academy, so there is a kind of lineage.
Yeah.
Do you, I mean, Dad and others are seen as this term, the outsiders, but of course he was trained at the Academy and he was close to a group of artists. You're obviously seen as part of an international generation of successful artists. You're a British artist, you had a German mother, you are loosely linked with a kind of conceptual, post-conceptual tradition. Some people have seen you as a kind of one of the precursors to YBA art. You know, the list goes on. So you're clearly part of an insider elite group of people in the art world. Discuss.
I went to Wolverhampton Polytechnic, everyone.
But I wonder still whether you see yourself as a part.
I think it's just part of everybody has a different sense of where they fit into the world, and I mean, I always feel myself as an outsider. At least of all because I went to Wolverhampton Poly and didn't go to London College.
So the London Art School would have made you more of the establishment.
Well, they didn't want me; they kept turning me down. So. But I don't. It doesn't. I think as a child, for example, as a teenager, I was very shy and withdrawn, and you know, perhaps in my mid-20s, I started to come out and be a bit more extrovert. And I suppose the making of the work where you have to ask people, you know, especially people in authority, to help you with something, people you're scared of. You know, like the National Rifle Association, or the police, or the army, or you know,
all of whom you've worked
or the
with.
MPs, or work with. But it's a way of kind of tussling with your own fears, I suppose.
Sleeping with the enemy, I think was how you put it.
Well, that's one way of calling it. But no, I suppose everybody is the enemy in a way, that you know, that you're dipping your toe into someone else's water, and then having a conversation about that. And I found that really creative. It's not necessarily comfortable, but it's somehow my comfort zone. I don't make work in the comfort zone. It's almost like I have to choose an uncomfortable place to be to make work. I mean, doing the government project I've just done was everybody else said, why are you doing that? Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to put yourself in a position where you have to make a piece of work in response to a very difficult election? And for some reason, it seemed to be the sanest place to be in this particular moment in history, where watching it as a passive observer made me feel ill.
So you think there's a certain, I mean, I use this term very carefully here in Bethlem, there's a certain political insanity going on at the moment. That would be one way of describing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think our parents, you know, we talk about leaders of the world or whatever, you know, that we're in a bad family situation at the moment, because I think the people who are in control we can't believe them.
And does art have a responsibility, or do you feel a responsibility for art somehow to ruminate on this?
Well, I think for me, I think being an artist is like a political act. It's an act of freedom. You know, you don't have to fit into the orthodoxy of, you know, I mean, the reason I'm a self-employed person, I find it very hard to be employed, because I don't want to follow the rules, because I don't know what the rules are, and I'm making them up as I go along. But for me, that's you know, a big imperative. You know, for example, the Royal Academy. You know, for quite some time I was thinking, oh, I don't want to be a Royal Academician. You know, it's too much of an establishment thing, and then as, you know, more and more rogue people seem to be Royal Academicians, I thought, oh, actually, I could be quite comfortable here. And I've actually enjoyed working with sometimes I really enjoy the limitations of the institution, and I can play with that.
So the constraints of an institution become something against which you can push or try
Yeah,
to break
I mean,
through.
I think it's, so sometimes you have to have something to push against, and then you know where your parameters are.
One of the views about Dad and his work is that there must be certainly a compulsive aspect. I think a lot of artists feel the compulsion to create, but perhaps there's a cathartic aspect. You've made it clear that where you're in some ways central to, but you're often removed from your own work, and your practice is so varied that it would be difficult to have an overall rule of thumb. But is art on occasion a cathartic thing for you? Blowing up a shed for some people, me, I think, would be a very cathartic act.
No, I think all the work is cathartic. I mean, it doesn't mean it's therapeutic. It can cause as many problems as it solves. But I think it's that need to have that kind of friction, to have that sort of movement. For example, I've just made 2 films for my election artist project. One's very fast, and it's 3 minutes long, and it's full of his animation and an Instagram feed I did, so it's about 1,500 images. Lots of people in it, lots of, and it's 12 frames a second, so it's a lot of information. And the other film, which is 8 minutes long, is very slow and meandering, and about a drone entering the house at night. And it's got no people in it, but both of them are me. And they both required a lot of, collecting of information, but they just use different parts of my brain, and somehow it's really good to use different parts of your brain and to not kind of create bunkers in your brain. It's almost like you need to be able to use all of it. You only use a tiny bit of it in a lifetime.
So these different rhythms actually is interesting, isn't it? And there's often duality in your work. I mean, again, that could be a reductive commentator's view or an art historical view, but order and chaos.
Left and right, up and down.
Yes, left and right, black and white. No, but black and yes, white. The big issues. But you often do seem. I mean, I'm thinking about, for example, a clock, the eclipse, as I called it, piece you did in St Pancras, where a white clock exists, you put 15 metres ahead of it a black clock, which is a replica. There are certain places in the station where you can see 2 clocks, dual time. There's certain positions where you see only one, it's eclipsed by another. But the profundity and the poetry of that and the colonisation of a vast amount of space was a very interesting thing, but it posited the whole idea of dualism, didn't it?
Well, yes, and as you move, that position changes. So you're looking at the time. Everybody looks at the time when they're in stations. That's what the clock is, the focal point, because everybody's trying to not be late. But because there's 2 clocks and you see them slightly different angles, it looks like it's slightly different time, and that's. It's a slippery thing, and I quite liked exploring that slippage. But what's the black clock represent? I called it one more time, so it's it could be, parallel time. It could be a night. It could be day. It could be a different kind of time that we don't even know exists. So it was. As you came off the train from France, the whole point of it, there's only certain points it'd be eclipsed, and that's when you're just about to enter Britain and go down those steps. So I don't know what that means, poor things. Those poor people coming to Britain from abroad. I just did it the other day, actually. I just came from France. But anyway, I like the idea of, that just taking something that exists, the found object, and then duplicating it. I thought that was an interesting thing.
And was there a dualism in the way you saw yourself as a child? I mean, an English father, a German mother. Now, that shouldn't matter, and of course it doesn't. It's culturally rich. But growing up as you did in the late 50s, early 60s, your mother must have had a reasonably. I mean, apart from the fact you said that she was mentally ill, but she must have had a very difficult 1950s.
Well, she had a very difficult 1940s.
Sorry, I took that as read, but you're quite right.
There was a hell of a lot of difficult.
Slightly less difficult 1950s, nonetheless a difficult 1950s. Yeah.
No, I think anywhere was preferable to Germany after post-war Germany. She suffered quite a lot. I think she was a nurse during the war. She's seen a lot of carnage. Her mother died when she was 3. Her father died just before she left Germany. I think she and everybody in Europe hated Germans, so she came to England on working a passage to try to get to Canada, and she stopped off to become an au pair for a while, and then she met my father, and stayed. But I think it was incredibly difficult for her in rural Cheshire, in 50s and 60s to I remember being called Nazi at school, by children because I had a name like Cornelia. But I think it was very hard for her. I didn't think it helped her at all with her mental illness. She became paranoid schizophrenic. I'm not sure it's to do with the war or to do with genetic things or to do with living in Britain as a German, but I think I felt different when I was at school, that I had a German mother, and I felt the guilt of what had happened in Germany, and so that was something as a child you didn't know how to digest, to learn about the Holocaust and then think, my mum was a German, and that's quite a big deal.
And you've said that your father treated you like a surrogate son because you grew up on a small farm and he wanted you to help.
Well, he wanted a son, but he got 3 daughters.
Yes.
And I'm just
thinking here, this may resonate subconsciously as a consequence of that.
Well, perhaps. I'm not sure. I was taking it a bit too far, I think.
Okay, it's fine. You stepped over a there.
But
No, but interestingly, when you became pregnant, so you then start to deal with maternity from a different perspective, it's very interesting the work that you produced.
Well, it was horrifying. I was 45 and I had never wanted to be a mother, but motherhood knocked on my door.
That's one way of describing it.
Sorry, forget that. But anyway, and I thought, okay, I'll go with this, go with the flow on this one. And I was doing I got my whole year planned out of shows I was doing, so I hadn't, I had to work right up to the moment she was born, really. And I was terrified. I was thinking, oh gosh, mentally ill mum, there's all kinds of baggage there. And the way I responded to it was to buy the nightgown that Mia Farrow wore in the film Rosemary's Baby, when she discovers she's her son's the devil, and because I was a bit worried. But I bought it online from a UNICEF auction in New York.
So you discovered that you didn't search it out. You discovered through your research and browsing that this was on sale, and it suddenly resonated with the feelings you had.
I had to have it. I had to buy this nightgown.
How much did you pay for it, by the way? I never asked.
Actually, about $6,000, which actually at the time was a lot of money. But I wanted it for a piece of work, apart from wanting to wear it when I gave birth.
Did you wear it when you gave birth?
Mia Farrow is much smaller than me. But anyway, but I was doing a show in Turin, and I was looking for a contemporary diptych for the Turin shroud. So I was looking at auction houses. I didn't know what that might be. And then when Mia Farrow's nightgown popped up, the film's all about giving birth to the devil, and the Turin shroud's all about the death of Christ. I thought, and
the replication of Christ's image.
Yeah, and so I just thought, well, this is... And that film I'd watched, in little bits, and I didn't realise, I always thought it was a horror film, but it's not, it's a psychological thriller. And if you go, I went to see it when I was pregnant at the National Film Theatre after I bought the nightgown, just to check it was the nightgown, which it was. But, and quite heavily pregnant by then. I realised that, the experience of her in the film, if you don't know the film, she feels that she's been raped by somebody and she gives birth to the devil, and her husband's in cahoots with the next door neighbours who are, the conduit for this. And but it could all be in her head. It could all be to do with lots of hormones when you're pregnant. And I didn't realise, when I saw it when I was pregnant, I thought, oh yes, hang on, this is a bit more complicated. This film, this is a much more complex thing. But I did like that idea of, there's a lot of stuff with that piece. I called it Blue Shift. I put it behind a frosted piece of glass, and you walk by, it shimmers, and it's kind of, it's like, I think it's the nearest I've got to doing something that's might be about the body in that way.
It's a very potent piece, just in the way it's presented. Even if you don't know this, there's a sort of ghostly presence of something trapped through a veil. Something that we can see but not quite see, it's familiar but not quite familiar. But the detail, the fact that we know it's from a film, that we know the backstory of the film, you then add the personal dimension of your own pregnancy and so on. These layers of richness obviously make it critically important. How much, when you've completed an installation or an object, do you feel that you have to just let it stand on its own 2 feet? And how much does the history have to be central to it? I mean, it's a completely different piece if you don't know it's Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it's an engaging work, whether you know it or not. And I mean, obviously, titling and captions are really important to me. you know, that I like to it's almost like a diptych, you know, so the titles and the work is completely, but blue shift is just is just a description of what it is, really. It's also an astronomical term about, a bit like the red shift, you know, the Doppler effect and measuring distance in space, but you know, it doesn't really matter if people know that. I mean, in the end, I hope that the work draws people in, but I do like using kind of
the traces of history.
But also cliches as well. I quite like using things that are very ubiquitous, very, you know, everybody knows what a gun is, everybody knows what the Psycho house looks like, you know, everybody knows what, you know, for me, for the Rosemary's Baby, everybody remembers the image of her with a knife looking over the pram wearing this blue nightgown. And so that's, so it's somehow these are kind of parts of society at large, not to do with me, but it's to do with, you know, like having a refrain from a popular song going through your head.
Which is exactly what is
this
happening
was,
here.
yes, yeah.
And I'm interesting about, I mean, again, it seems to me that art can appear to you, or ideas for art can appear wherever you are. I mean, Dad illustrated Shakespeare, illustrated famous a book of ballads. This Crazy Jane is a ballad,
Yes.
and yet the image is then triggered by something, and it's very much from his imagination. He's one of the great imaginative artists in the British tradition, isn't he?
Yes.
This idea, though, of art presenting itself, do you have notebook after notebook of ideas, or do things kind of germinate in the back of your mind, and when you have a show or a commission or a deadline, you can draw on them?
I think the whole idea of this lightning flash and an idea comes to you in the middle of the night is to do with you picking up thousands of little bits of the idea over the years, and you're building it up without perhaps even knowing it and recognising it, and then when it comes to you in a flash, it's because it's come on your radar. You've suddenly realised what it is, but it's been there for a long time. So I don't think anything's instantaneous. It's just taking lots of microscopic bits of information from all over the place, and it crystallises at some point. And that's when the work appears. And so, you know, the nightgown and Rosemary's Baby, and you know, I knew at the moment I saw that nightgown and brochure, I had to have it. And this was, you know, you didn't have to work out what the backstory or anything was. I just had to have it. So I don't worry about what the work means or what the content of the work. Later you could do reverse engineering on all that, but you just have to follow your intuition, which is not, you know, intuition is based on knowledge. You know, it's based on lots of microscopic knowledge. And I think that's where the instantaneous idea might come from, that you've been picking up little bits of information for a long time and it gels.
I'm interested in the context of what you just said, and actually what you just said earlier about religion. Religion can be a cliche, but it's certainly something that informs a lot of the way that people perceive or see the world. There are a lot of familiar objects that exist in art and the world that come from religion. This isn't a clunky way of bringing it back to Dad, but Dad obviously had religious visions and then religious delusions. I mean, he thought the Egyptian god Osiris spoke to him, he wanted to kill the Pope, he ended up killing his own father. You were brought up a Catholic. And you've said on numerous occasions that you have no belief now, but is religion something that art still for you has a relationship with? Is it surrogate religion? Is it completely the opposite? And how does it work for you?
Well, I think it is. It's a kind of a belief system, isn't it? It's about making something tangible that's not tangible. But you know, it was in the Louvre the other day in Paris. You know, so much religiosity in art. You know, it seems to be the main impotence for a long time. Richard Dad's one of the few people who weren't overtly painting about religion. So it's so ubiquitous up till, you know, perhaps 100 years ago. So it's just, and now 20th century and 21st century art is quite liberating. So we've left, but you know, the fact that Tate Modern is opposite St Paul's Cathedral is quite nice. I think that, you know, it is a way of having a spiritual life that's not to do with, you know, God. That, you know, you can, you know, music and art and theatre and all that can release an inner life that doesn't have to be dependent on the present thing, you know. So I think that's quite, and it's about humanity, and it's about the spirits of all the people who've gone before, who've made all these great works. So I think I don't know, so, and also as a child in a Catholic church, you know, the Catholic church is so much more overtly visual. You know, everything's very laid out, very, you know, the bleeding, you know, heart, the Stations of the Cross. You know, it's all about imagery, and the relic, So there's a lot of rich visual impetus from Catholic iconography, you know, which you don't necessarily get in the Protestant church.
No, and I didn't think I was going to talk about transubstantiation with you tonight, but seeing as you've hinted at
Inevitably.
it. Inevitably. But I suppose the notion of alchemy or transformation, a belief system where you believe fundamentally that something is changed from one state to another, underpins quite a lot of what your practice as an artist is, isn't it?
If you say so. If you say so.
Yes is the correct answer.
Oh yes, okay, yes.
But this isn't conscious. I mean, so for example, when you take a piece, you take 31 pieces of silver.
30.
30, sorry, but then there's and you crush it. 30 pieces of silver has biblical overtones, betrayal, and it's a very violent piece, although the result is quite a serenely explored thing. Religion is not at the heart of that. It's just one part. It's one belief. It's one belief system. It's one layering of cultural
I'm borrowing
meaning.
that cliche of the 30 pieces of silver and its all its connotations as an object. Really, I like that's another found object. That 30 pieces of silver is the title. You know, for anybody who knows where it comes from, it's you know, there's a whole set of associations to do with that as an object. So I quite like the title being like another found object. So 30 pieces of silver, and then I crush not 30 pieces, but hundreds of pieces of silver, and then I create 30 pools of suspended silver, which had now been resurrected, you know, on wires, and so they give them some volume back after I took it away. But you know, and then the silver's got its own little bubble of information that's attached to it, which, you know, it all has connotations of wealth or privilege or, you know, tarnish or whatever, and I quite like those associations. So somehow with all these different, and then suspension has another association, and so those, and spatially it does something which makes you feel very disoriented. And I've got terrible fear of heights, you know, so there's a kind of weird sort of bit of psycho-geography thing going on with it too. So there's all these ingredients which I'm not, you know, analysing and mapping them out and saying I want a work that has this, this and this. It's a very intuitive and quick process. And then when it feels right, I know it's finished.
I'd forgotten that if I ever knew you had a fear of heights. So presumably, you standing on the edge of Beachy Head, throwing words, letters off the head, is an extreme example of you putting yourself quite close to the edge of your comfort zone.
Well, I mean, I had a rope around me at the time with some people hanging on it, but you can't see that in the photographs. But yes, no, but it was, no, but it was very terrifying. But that's me creating. I made words out of lead that was like a dictionary definition of gravity. So all the words from the dictionary. But there's two definitions. One to do with pull on you, and the other one is about gravitas, grey forts, and the dark side of things. And I quite like that. And they're literally throwing these words off the White Cliffs of Dover, and then them landing on the rocks and becoming this scrambled mess of, you know, real gravity had undermined the man-made definition of it, and I quite like that. So I called it the words that define gravity. So it was sort of defining it in a different way, in a very physical way. And I suppose Beachy Head's got this kind of horrible connotations to it too, about suicide and, you know, jingoism and the White Cliffs of Dover, flying over the White. So for me, the White Cliffs of Dover are quite a potent symbol that I, you know, just made a piece in Kettle's Yard for the reopening when I painted the windows of Mrs. Eade's bedroom with little strokes of white chalk from the White Cliff. So she's looking out through a veil of chalk. But you know, since Brexit's happened, the White Cliffs of Dover, you know, the white chalk that I'm so drawn to brings on a different meaning as well for me.
People often describe your aspects of your practice as violent, and I suppose if you describe it, as I just said at the beginning, if you steamroll or shoot or explode things, they are violent processes. But it seems to me that energy seems as much as important in that situation than violence per se. But are you interested in violent forms of transformation?
No, I think violent forms of transformation are around us all the time. You know, from the weather to lightning to, you know, volcanoes erupting to, you know, the stuff we see on TV every day. I mean, you know, violence is around us all the time. It's part of our psyche. It's part of, you know, the child's naturally much more violent than a grown-up. So I think it's something that we, you know, are embracing as part of the whole alphabet of emotions. but usually after the violence in my work, there's a bit of a calm aftermath, that I'm trying to calm the violence.
Heal, repair, restore?
Well, perhaps heal, repair, restore, if you would like.
I would, among other things. Finally, but just before I throw you out to the floor, I just want to ask you, as you know, we're sitting in front of a work that you've been compelled to look at and bring to our attention. You've looked in all sorts of ways at works of art in the past, and it's always curious for people to understand how artists work with other art, with other artists, with other traditions. Do you treat art, in terms of the inspiration and the input into your work, as in categorical distinction to the traces of history in Freud's couch, or literature, or the replica of the Empire State Building that you then recast and produce work with? Or is it just another source for you? And I'm not asking it disrespectfully.
Yeah. No, it's just another source. It's just another source. And, when I used Rodin's The Kiss, when I wrapped it up in a mile of string, The Kiss is one of the most revered sculptures in Britain, and it refers to romantic love. And then you get Duchamp's Mile of String, which he draped over a surrealist exhibition, as the opposite. It was like a disrupting force. And so the idea of wrapping up Rodin, the kiss, so you can't see the kiss anymore, but everybody knows what the kiss looks like. And back to the history of that piece, when it was first shown in Britain, which was turn of, in the early 1900s, the British public found it too lewd. It was under wraps for 2 years because nobody could look at it.
So you recensored it?
Yeah, so I recensored it, and all of a sudden it kind of, people got angry that I was, obstructing the view of the kiss. And I called it The Distance, which is the opposite, and in brackets, a kiss with string attached.
Aren't they all?
Yes, of course. Things are much more complicated than you think. And romantic love, as we know, has got all its complications. And then some stuckists, which are these, sort of anti-20th century art and 21st century art, came and cut the string off it at the tape when it was on display and made a performance out of it. And then I took all the string and tied it together and put it back on the sculpture.
So in the Duchampian way, that was a re-amended ready-made, was it? And
It was.
You, in a sense, so you were reasonably. I mean,
this hot historian.
Sorry, I'm just. But you weren't so annoyed by their intervention.
No, I suppose they've said I'd vandalised Rodin, and they were vandalising me. So I was, repairing the vandalism that they'd done, which seemed to be all part of the process. And it's like Duchamp, when his large glass broke, he didn't say, "Oh dear, let's make another one."
He embraced chance, didn't he?
He embraced chance, and I think I like chance. That is an interesting. And then I used the ball of string. When I took the string off the kiss, I wrapped it around a weapon, which I'm not going to tell you what it is. But so it's now a ball of string. It's called The Distance with concealed weapon. So instead of romantic love being in the middle of the string, it's now something the opposite.
Unromantic hate, potentially. Let's embrace chance and throw you to the floor. Who would like to ask a question of Cornelia? Please feel free. Yes.
So in your work, I've observed you like to explore what is seen and then what lies beneath. And I kind of like wondering with social media and how people like to use their profiles to project who they are as this, often perfect image versus who they really are. And there's a really interesting gap
between those two things. Yeah.
And I wonder whether the themes that you explore in your work and kind of like social media, I know you've been working with social media as like a distribution device. Yeah. Does it percolate in your mind?
Well, I think I'm just doing Instagram for the first time. I didn't realise Instagram was just a vehicle mostly for selfies. And in fact, the Guardian newspaper a couple of years ago, before I even knew what a selfie was, asked me if I could give them a selfie, because they were asking about people, and I didn't know what a selfie was. So I did one of my worry lines and one of my feet, and they're going, it's not exactly what we wanted. But and then when I saw the article, I realised what the selfie was all about. And my daughter, who's 16, she's constantly pouting and taking pictures and showing me 20 pictures. Which one shall I post? And she usually wants the one that least looks like her, and subscribe to some kind of weird notion of what beauty is, and it's a very curious thing. I think it is. I'm trying to come to grips with it. I'm enjoying Instagram myself, but I'm not using it to take photographs of my friends.
I love that lateral approach. Immediately, she deconstructs a selfie without knowing what it is, and it's literally head to toe, but completely different to any other selfie that seems to have existed.
Well, it's something to be said for not being an expert. And now my daughter Lily is an expert in the selfie, as all her friends are. But it's very curious. And she won't let me join her Instagram, so I can't see the images. That's a bit worrying.
And you don't join under another name, and you're not going to tell us if you did. Were there other questions?
I wonder if I might ask about that link between mental health and art. When Richard Dad was in hospital, the Bethlem gave him materials to carry on, and that was quite unusual. And I wondered if we were talking about being incarcerated, and if you weren't able to do your art, how that would affect your mental health if you were stopped from having that creative urge.
Well, I think it would make me ill. I think creativity is a fantastic way of channeling energy. And I'm working a lot with prisoners, on embroidery projects. I did one called the Magna Carta, where they hand embroidered the Wikipedia page of the Magna Carta. And the prisoners really, are incarcerated for a long time for heinous crimes. But they say it's impossible to be angry when you're sewing. And I like that idea that, and I think when you're making art, I'm not saying anger can't be part of it, but I think it's a very therapeutic thing. And I think it's like, at the moment, I'm really horrified that, that 8% art in schools and humanities in schools has dropped by 8% when the creative industries are our biggest export and our biggest engine. And that means, 8% less kids are getting the outlet. Imagine our profits going down 8%. I just think it's a false economy to not allow people to be creative, which they are naturally as children. So I think it's hugely important that people are allowed access to it.
It's really interesting we have to make the economic argument, but that seems to be the only one that plays out in the broad political arena. Yeah. But it's a very interesting question, actually.
Yeah.
About
I think now, it's crazy now, when in this point in time that we're seeing this huge drop-off and, that art is demoted and not valued, and mathematics is, maths and art are equally important, just use different parts of the brain, that's all.
Well, interestingly enough, Facebook, a question's just come in from Michelle Ward, just thinking about technology, which seems to imply, it's a very nice question, but it seems to imply you're older than you are, so let's make it clear that you're still, you're approaching artistic maturity rather than reached it. But she says, looking back over your life, what would you, thank you Michelle, what would you most wish to be remembered for?
Oh gosh, well, for my art I suppose.
Yes, I think we took that as a given.
Which particular piece?
Yeah, it's a very difficult
thing to answer. Or for my daughter, Lily?
No, but would there be an aspect of your art, the cumulative momentum of parts of it, or are there particular pieces that you're more proud of than others?
I think it's curious because there's certain works that I did years ago that I'm now beginning to appreciate much more than I did when I first made them. So, obviously the Exploded Shed is one of my, highlights. My Psycho Barn, which I did a couple of years ago on the Metropolitan Museum's roof, which was the Psycho House, the set for the Psycho House, made out of an old red barn from upstate New York. So it was splicing two bits of architecture, one which is benign and one that's malign.
Someone really should bring that to Britain.
Put it on your list.
Watch this space. Yeah, who knows?
Put it on your list, dear. Embryo firearms, which these two guns I took from the Colt Firearms Factory, which are preemptive guns, which they gave the finish of the finished gun to. That's a very simple, found object, modified, ready-made. You want to use them to, but that's still a very, pertinent piece to me. So I don't know. I just hope that the work provides a catalyst for people to go off on their own journeys with. That's the whole intention for me of making work.
That was a very candid and spirited reply. Actually, most artists are trying to avoid it, but I'm really glad you took it with the horns.
Shit.
No, because
Four-letter word, everyone, and delete that.
Not a problem. But because it's not that your work won't have longevity, it emphatically will, physically and culturally. But you do seem to be interested in exploring the idea of the anti-monument. I mean, memory and memorial is essential. The barn piece, I mean, those barns have existed for a century, and they're fairly hardy material, but to reconstruct it and then rebuild and then replace it, it probably isn't going to be sited somewhere for eternity. So I quite like the fact that you both see longevity, but you're not aspiring to make a monument that will exist in a public place for the next 500 years.
No, I mean, some of my favourite artists is Yves Klein and Pierre Manzoni. And Manzoni's balloons that he blew up and put on a plinth, and it was called Breath of an Artist, which then obviously the breath disappeared, and now they're little perished bits of rubber that museums are desperately trying to reconstruct and conserve. But somebody collected them, they're there because somebody, perhaps a private collector, looked after it and gave it to a museum. But so little things are just as important, and ephemeral things, as big monuments. And I think when I was at school, the idea of sculpture didn't really appeal to me, because I always thought about big monuments and, solid lumps on plinths, and that didn't really appeal to me.
So you reconfigured the whole idea of the sculptural object, and long may you continue to do so. We have to end it there. I want to thank the Bethlem Museum of the Mind for staging this, making this possible. Yeah. It's been terrific. I'd also just like to draw attention to that we'll be back soon with more objects of obsession. Sonia Boyce from the Manchester Art Gallery with a compelling portrait, and Bob and Roberta Smith at the new Art Gallery in Walsall with a sculpture by Epstein of his daughter. And if you want to find out more, you can follow the hashtag Objects of Desire, or even go on the Bethlem Museum of the Mind website. But I would like to end, Cornelia, by thanking you for your intuitive, thoughtful, eloquent and always engaging conversation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.